Hello again. I would like to introduce Dr. Mary Townsend. Dr. Townsend is an independent spirometry and epidemiology consultant for industrial, government, and research clients, and an adjunct assistant professor of environmental and occupational health at the Graduate School of Public Health, University of Pittsburgh. She is course director for the Johns Hopkins Education and Research Center for Occupational Safety and Health. She consults for OSHA's Directorate of Standards and Guidance and helped develop the document on spirometry testing in occupational health programs, best practices for healthcare professionals. She received the 2013 ACOM Award for Health Achievement in Occupational Medicine. Her goal is to teach not only what the recommendations and requirements are, but why they were developed. Please welcome Dr. Townsend.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm pleased to be here today, and we're only going to be talking today because it's a short time length about interpreting occupational spirometry, and it is extremely current and I think extremely urgent right now for people that are practicing in occupational health. So, first of all, I have to thank Marcom for the invitation, and especially I need to thank Mary Doyle and Keith Choi for all of their support for all of the teaching I have done at Hopkins over the years. They have been stupendous to work with. And she has recently, as many of you know, retired as the director of the ERC. So I really appreciate the invitation. I have been active with ACOM for decades. And usually we teach the pre-conference spirometry course at AOHC. But this year, because of surgery, I'm doing very, very little traveling. And so I'm very appreciative of you having me come virtually for this. But next year, Clay Cole and I have plans to be back in Austin to teach the class ahead of the conference again. So I look forward to that. So the agenda is different from usual. The very first thing I always do, which I've had physicians in my classes, my NIOSH approved course classes, comment on, that they didn't know, that they were never told in any of their other courses that maybe those observed values are incorrect. And I was like, wow, that's like the cornerstone of spirometry. But so usually I am focusing on making sure measured values are free of technical errors, both equipment and also testing technique. But today we have a very big development in the area of interpreting spirometry, and which is unusual to have that. And so we're going to focus only on interpretation. And so we will very radically, for me, assume that the measured values are accurate. We have a paper in progress called The Impacts of the GLI Global, which is also called Race Neutral Prediction Equations in Occupational Health. It isn't done. I wish it was, and then I could give it out, but it isn't. But to do that paper, it really got going because I was wondering what happens really from the nuts and bolts standpoint when you change reference values. And so I did tons and tons of hand calculations, and of course checked them many times to find out the answer to that. And in the meantime, I realized that what we're looking at when you have heard of GLI, if you've heard of GLI Global, which I presume you may have, and also this I think it's a misleading phrase, race neutral, but in any case, that's how it is packaged. But so I didn't know how much of a change that is in what a reference value is. It is a sea change. And so that's why it's important, I think, for you to understand more information about reference values how they've evolved over time. And then also what does occupational health, what's required and what is recommended that you can't just like walk away from. And so all those things I learned, and they are part of our paper, but I'm going to share them today because they're important. So the first thing is to talk about reference values. We have had they have been called race-specific values. It's not, all it is saying is that it was a narrow group of people who were tested. And generally they were, for a very long time, they were white. but now it's not that. But so the thing that is important to realize is all of this has not been going on for that long, maybe 60 something years. And so, because the technology, as it always does in medicine, it determines what you can measure. And so, the ability to measure how much came out very fast, which is FEV1, it just wasn't there for a long time. And then the chymograph drum turned, and then that made it all possible. We got volume time curves. FEV1 was first defined in 1947, and that was in French by Tiffenot, and then the ratio was defined in 1951 by Gainsler in English. But so 10 years went by, and then the very first prediction equation, to my knowledge, came out from Corey et al., which was a VA Army cooperative study. They just only meant they included smokers. They were not impaired, so they did check for respiratory health. But that was the very first one that came out, and that was the only one, as far as I know, that was out there from, for about 10 years. Then in the 70s and the 80s, what we can see is that these reference values, these populations or studies that we're comparing your worker to, they are getting much more focused in what is the question that we're asking here. And so, first of all, they became all non-smoking from the 70s on, and they also were men and women. They remained white, and so they were race specific for whites. The one that you might, Crapo was used, I think, for disability for quite a while. Knudsen may be familiar because it was in the 1978 cotton dust standard. It came out in 1976, so it was a very current study at that point. And so then that we move forward again, like by almost 20 years. NIOSH with Dr. Hankinson, my boss from NIOSH, ran the NHANES study. And what it was remarkable what they did. They went around the country, they had a random sample of the entire US population, and they took 1/3 African Americans, 1/3 whites, and 1/3 Mexican Americans. It was the first time that was ever done on a major scale. The thing that was, and so each of those groups now is having its own race specific equation. That's what came out of that. So for instance, I would identify as white female. And so what that would mean is I would only be compared with the white equations, and of those, only the female equations. And so, in other words, we make it a very narrow group who are like me. They have been chosen because they don't smoke, they're asymptomatic, and they are the group, the race group that they belong to. But so I see a lot of times this idea that it is race correction. It's not that. These are real people. These are real measurements that were made. And so when we see differences in NHANES especially, we are looking at a real difference. For some reason, there's a big difference with racial group. So that's what we'll talk about that in a minute. NHANES was absolutely remarkable. I have been an epidemiologist for decades. I don't think I've seen another study that controlled the quality of the testing as effectively as they did. It was a lot of work. I was in Morgantown at that point at NIOSH, and there were full-time people working on this, reviewing graphs all the time. It would have driven me crazy. But in any case, but the thing that they did is they had it was one big giant study of like 7,500 people across the country. They had one testing protocol, one type of equipment, one set of technicians who rode around in a big tractor trailer van, and every single test was reviewed. The graph was reviewed for technical quality, and the techs were periodically retrained. All of that attention to detail, what that gives you is the ability to compare men versus women, Black versus white versus Mexican American. You have a look at the effective height, look at the effective age. All of those things are absolutely legitimate comparisons because everything that could have been different among those groups has been held constant. It was very impressive. And because of that, In 2005, the ATS, in conjunction with European Respiratory Society, they actually endorsed the NHANES for use in North America. That had never, ever happened before. Well, it has now. They talk about GLI, which we'll get to. But that was the first time. And so that was a big deal. So, yeah,
Would you
yes.
mind speaking? Would you mind speaking a little bit louder into your
Okay.
microphone?
You know what I wonder? Okay. Is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Oh,
Thank you.
oh, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Because I was sitting kind of back in the chair, so now I'm very close to the laptop that projects this onto my thingies. Is it okay?
Yes.
Is
Yeah,
it
that's
loud
perfect.
enough now? Okay, good. Thank you for stopping me. There's nothing like a mumbling presentation to listen to, right? For a whole 45 minutes. It's a long 45 minutes. Okay. So then the things that happened are the next step that actually happened is in 2012. But first, there's something important to remember. OSHA, when they did their cotton dust standard in 1978, whoops, it jumps like that sometimes. And so, but that the equipment that was used, it was all volume spirometers. It wasn't any of these flow type spirometers like what mostly everybody uses now. And so they got an opportunity to do a technical update on the reg and they jumped at it. So they really overhauled the cotton dust standard. It's brilliant. Their new one, their Appendix D, the technical appendix. It's definitely state of the art. And so, but what one of the things they did is they said, okay, we have these old equations from 1976. We're going to replace them with this star-studded value from NHANES, which ATS, endorsed. And so that became the mandatory equation to be used under the cotton dust standard. That is not mentioned under all these, asbestos, silica. They don't talk about what reference values to use, which we'll come to in a second. But for cotton, that is mandatory, which we have, since I teach virtually, I have people from cotton mills, which I never had before. So, but the thing I think to notice here, and I talk with a lot of people to see what they perceive is going on. And one smart, good friend, he said to me, well, Mary, we've changed reference values before when we were talking about moving from the current, whatever you're using, like say NHANES, to GLI Global. And I said, yeah, we have, but they were very different changes. And that is the problem right there. It's not that we haven't had experience with having to use a different comparison group. And so the very best example of that, which I need to point out to you, is when we did the switch from Knudsen to NHANES. That actually happened earlier than 2019 when they finally put it into the reg. But all that was one narrow study, a race-specific study, which all the people in Knudsen, they were all white men and women, non-smokers, asymptomatic. And what did we do? We switched it with another equation where we had a bunch of a random sample of white men and women, non-smoking, asymptomatic. And so the thing that has been held constant is we are making a very narrow comparison here. And so the thing that is different between those two, which was radically different, is the equipment is very different and the protocols are different because it's, whatever, how many used 20 years later. So in Knudsen, they designed their own pneumotac, which was one of the first, that was experimental for them. And it was in a research study. But so that was one of the earliest of the flow type spirometers. So it measures how fast the air comes out, adds the speeds up to get the volumes. This, what we use in NHANES, it was a volume. It was a dry rolling seal spirometer, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen and used. I loved them. They're very accurate and precise. And it doesn't matter how fast the air comes. If it's moving the piston, it just keeps recording it. But with the other technique, with flow type spirometers, it doesn't always work that way because they set a line at the 0 point at which they define it as no flow. And so in order to make it more accurate, what they tend to do sometimes is under record. And so they stop the expiration. And so what we see with Knudsen is very often lower FVCs than what we see with NHANES. Whoops, I keep sitting back. Is that better again? I'm sorry. Just, somebody needs to, there's nobody here to like hit me over the head and say, Mary, move forward. Anyway, but in any case, so this is a type of switching for the reason of accuracy of measurements. But other than that, it is nothing different than what we always have done. It is still race specific, and it's changed to a new race specific. Okay, so then in 2012, this thing that you have heard a lot, which I never lectured about because it is complicated and it takes a lot of study in order to get your arms around it. I'm not an author of this equation, but I know a lot more about it than I ever did before. And so it is called Global Lung Initiative, and the abbreviation is GLI. And in 2012, the decision was made that we needed something besides NHANES, not we in the US, but Europe and the rest of the world, because they weren't sure that NHANES would extrapolate to other places. So if they had done a wonderful, big, huge NHANES around the globe, it would have been stupendous. They didn't do that. That would be very hard to do. And so what they did instead is they found 72 different studies in 33 different countries and that had done reference values. They had done prediction equations, and they reviewed the data for consistency. They did not review the graphs, but they had a ton then of equations. And what they figured out is that based on the country that the person was in, they had 4 race-specific groups. And so what they did is combine within that group, they combined those relevant equations, and then that was whites, and then blacks really was African Americans from NHANES, because NHANES was part of this. And then Northeast Asians and Southeast Asians, which are absolutely not interchangeable. And that is a huge issue. But in any case, they did that. So we have now 4 race-specific groups rather than NHANES has 3. But they also did another thing. Because if you have people with one parent who is, say, black and one who is white, then maybe they don't put themselves into a category. And so if that's true, they are multiracial. And then where do they go? Well, among these 4 race-specific equations, there's nowhere for them to go. And so what they did is they took an average of those 4 equations, of those 4 values, and that average was called the 5th group, but it isn't a separate group. It's an average of all of their other measurements put together, and that is called GLI other. GLI, when people tell me, oh yeah, we use GLI, I know they don't know the details of it, and the details are incredibly important. So, because it means you're going to be doing a different kind of evaluation. So they constructed this other group. That is not race specific. That is not one of their 4 groups of basic data from the Global Lung Initiative. And so that is the new category. It is not race specific anymore. What we're looking at is a racial composite. And so that is a different kettle of fish entirely from what looking at a narrow little group is. So we had 2 ATS statements one was in 2019, technical statement. One was in 2022, which was interpretation. And what both of them said, they have a 2-step interpretation approach. And so they say, when you fit into one of these 4 categories, white, black, Southeast Asian, Northeast Asian, then use those. That's the very first thing they both say. But if the person, your subject, doesn't fit into that, and the common reason is that the person is multiracial, that probably was less when 25 years ago when NHANES was out, it wasn't as much of an issue. Now it is a big issue in many places. And so that means you stick them into this average, you compare them to this average, this other thing. And then in addition, if they don't fit into one of those groups, then again, you use this average. But that average is not new data. It is not a new race-specific value. It is an average of their other 4 categories. So it is not ever anything that it's just like an escape valve for the people that don't fit into here. Okay, so now we go on. So here's 2022. The next year, ATS came out with one of the most radical statements that they have ever made, I think. And it is a real sea change in how we use these equations. And that's why I think and that's why we're writing the paper. It poses a problem in occupational health. And so the thing that what they say is there's no 2-step thing here anymore. There's no race specific values where you're looking at people that are narrowly like you. The only thing that they want you to use is one value for everybody on the planet, for all racial groups, even if you have, like I fit into the white female category, no question. And so, but am I allowed to be using that? No, I have to use GLI Global if I follow this recent interpretation. So the question is, what does that do? And so that's what we're going to talk about here. So the thing that they did is they called it race neutral, and they called it that because the tech does not have to ask the subject, what group do you belong to, which is very handy, and which there's other things that we're involved in that may help with that, which would get race off the plate entirely, which I think is excellent to do. But the thing that is true, neutral suggests to me, and I think it would to a lot of normal, regular people, that we've taken care of race. It's not a problem here anymore. The problem, though, is we didn't, right? I mean, we didn't do anything, but the authors of the equation, what did they do? How did they come up with this? They averaged these 4 groups. And so absolutely, they explicitly said that every one of those groups will count equally in this one single value that we're going to use for the entire planet. That is not neutral. That is a composite. And so I think it's a real issue, that thing. But that's the thing we're going to talk about because that's what's been recommended. The thing that they did say, though, in their recommendation is they said that because this is a brand new recommendation, the study of what this does downstream in the real world, that is imperative. And that's a very strong word to use, and I totally agree with it. So let's talk about occupational spirometry briefly. I don't know when I started. Okay. Anyway, so what we do in occupational health, and this is the part I'm talking about. I'm not talking about medical surveillance that looks at longitudinal measurements. That's a different issue. In occupational health, though, I would say the majority of the people who I teach in NIOSH-approved courses, as well as many people who are ACOM members, what is happening is that the people who come in who are required by their company or a regulation or a recommendation to be evaluated, we're looking at them in 2 different ways. One part of the people that we are saying, can you work? Are you fit for duty? Can you wear a respirator? So our question is, are you above a cut point? That's our question. The other one, though, is saying, are you below a cut point? Because what we're looking at is, are you disabled? Have your lungs been affected by your job? So we look at those 2 those are our 2 main applications that I'm considering here. So both the OSHA and the Department of Energy mandate spirometry under several standards. NIOSH does under the Coal Worker Health Surveillance Program. And recently, MSHA finally put out their silica rule, their RCS, respirable crystalline silica rule, as well as improving respiratory protection. It came out only at the end of, or in mid-April. So I see the differences between it and the OSHA silica standard, but I haven't had a time to really, get a hold of that one. Okay, so the reference values, though, the regulations and recommendations, all these things that are mentioned in here, they set mandatory cut points and thresholds. And all of those cut points and thresholds are based on race-specific equations because that's all we've used for 60 years. Now, What is explicitly requiring a specific reference equation is the cotton dust standard from OSHA. That's the only one of all the OSHA regs that does, and the Coal Worker Health Surveillance Program. They explicitly require NHANES 3. Now, the AMA Guides 6th edition also currently mandates the NHANES 3. The other thing that I have learned with all of this, which many people here would know far more about this, and if you have information that I have left off, please email me and let me know, because it would be very helpful. It is a thing of talking to different people and putting together a patchwork. But in any case, those guides for disability and impairment, they underlie statutes in 19 different states and also several federal agencies. This whole web of occupational requirements and recommendations is very spread around all over the place. And then finally is National Fire Protection Association currently recommends the use of NHANES. Okay, so this is finally my slide that will show you, this is from our paper, well, a version of it, and it shows you what is going on here. So in our paper, I wanted to know what happens when you look at all these different reference values, right? That was my main question. And so I thought, well, that might be, I think what we need is a sample working person. And so I picked a 30-year-old who is 70 inches tall, which is 178 centimeters. So I picked him as my example. And then I calculated using all of their online calculators, and I did it multiple times since it's hand calculations, what would be the FVC that we would get, the predicted values, and also the lower limit of normal for those characteristics. I wondered, that's a pretty big reference value, a pretty big average that we expect predicted value. And I wanted to know, what is it for an older person who's shorter also, who would still be employed? So I picked 60 years and 60 inches, but the patterns that you see are identical with these two. So that did not matter. The thing that really, really, really mattered is race. And so the racial composites I mentioned already. They are GLI other, which is intended to be used at least as an escape valve, and then GLI global, which ATS is recommending, one value for everybody in all these groups. Now, the thing that we see here is we have black, and these are ordered in the order that they are getting bigger FVCs, bigger lungs. We have black, then we have Southeast Asian, then we have Northeast Asian, and then we have white. And what do we see for FVC? It just knocks my eyes out when I see it. So we go from black, which is 4.62 liters. It increases for Southeast Asians to 486. All of these people are 30 years old and 70 inches tall. We get to Northeast Asians, who are Northern China and Korea, and they are a little bit bigger again. So these two are not identical to each other. And the idea that you can just smuzzle them together is a mistake. And then white is giant. And so, in fact, the difference in the average that we expect for your size of your lungs between black and white is 0.84 liters. It is flippin' massive, is what it is. I had somebody in a committee once ask me, is it clinically significant? I thought, holy shamoly, this is like a 20% difference. I would say so for anything, you know. And then when you look at the lower limit of normal, again, it's huge. This difference, this whole how this is, and what a difference there is, gets kind of buried when all you do is look at when you look at equations all the time instead of numbers. I am a numbers person, and when I see numbers like this, I'm like, wow, something is going on. So what is it? Well, so the next is, what's causing these differences? I think it's complex. Now the focus has been very much on social determinants of health, air pollution, social variables, but also in the previous, before that was emphasized as much, it seemed to be quite clear that there's a difference based on ancestry in the two lengths of what we really want to know is your thorax length. And so what we have to use is standing height, because you can get it pretty accurately. You can measure it. But so then what is the standing height made of? Thorax plus legs. So if legs are long, thorax is small, gives you a small FVC. If legs are short, thorax is longer, gives you a big FVC. But so we still have to deal with that in a design study, which I am working with Brian Graham on that, but we'll see how that goes. But in any case, the differences primarily now have been ascribed to the differences in social determinants of health. So what I want to show you as a final thing is what's going to happen if you make the switch from race specific here to GLI global. And this is shocking. And this is what you see and there have been a number of studies done. And what they all are finding is that for African Americans, the values, their lung function appears to be crummier. They are reclassified as impaired. And for white people, they are looking better and they are not impaired anymore. This is over and over and over again. This is interpreted as being race. I think it's math is what's going on. And so, and at least it's there, right? We have to pay attention to it. So what I decided to do in our study, we have 80% of predicted, these are all race specific that we use. 80% of predicted 100 and 120. So I figured for this slide, I'll just show you the people that are closest to the bottom of the normal range, which is 80% of race specific values. They're pretty close to lower limit of normal, but they're still in the normal range. So if we calculate 80% of this, of this, of this, of this, it gives us these numbers. These very much increase, these very much increase. So these are going to be our observed values. So I am now looking at the impact for somebody who is 80% of predicted of their race-specific value of switching from their actual observed FVCs to using this average thing here, which you can see is smack in the middle. We have two groups that are below the average. We have two groups that are above it. Now, so when you're not going to divide now 370 by 462. You're going to divide 370 by 520. What the heck happens? Of course, it gets smaller, right? You're dividing by a huge denominator. So now the guy, instead of being 80% of predicted, which would allow him to be passing an evaluation, he's at 71% of predicted. He's very seriously not at that level anymore. Next level up, Southeast Asians, they are 75% of predicted. But now we cross that average line. And so what happens? Well, now these people had bigger FVCs than this average, because that's how averages work, of course, right? You get some that are below, some that are above, and bang, it's in the middle. And so the thing that we can see is, okay, so now we're going to divide this by this slightly smaller number. Percent of predicted goes up to 81%. For whites, now we are saying 437 divided by 520. We're now at 84%. What's this going to do to our evaluations? That means that people who are white or people with big lungs, and they happen to be white, those people will pass these evaluations more when you use GLI Global, and people with small lungs who happen to be Black or Southeast Asian, but particularly Black, it's the smallest group, they will not pass the evaluation if what we're looking at is, fitness for duty or wearing a respirator. It will go the other way if what we're looking at is the other thing, which is, are you below the cutoff? And so now all of a sudden, these people who are actually normal are going to be called impaired. They're going to be called maybe disabled if they're far enough down. These people who maybe were disabled, they were below a cut point, now they're not. And so they're going to miss out on that. So it cuts two different ways, depending upon what you're looking at. Okay, so the major conclusions, I think, are that when you compare Blacks and Southeast Asians with GLI Global, their measured values appear to go down. When you compare whites or Northeast Asians with GLI Global, their measured values appear to go up. And our conclusion in our paper is that predicted values that affect different groups in opposite ways will probably exclude people of color, when you're using spirometry evaluations, when you're doing them in the occupational setting. So the takeaways, I think, are, for now, I would use a race-specific normal range. Sometimes you have to use NHANES. What I have been realizing is not having an escape valve with NHANES. You don't have an other category with NHANES. That's a problem a lot. It's happening much more now. If it's not mandatory that you use NHANES according to recommendations and, and regs, then I would consider following the GLI, the 2019-2022 recommendations, which is use the GLI race-specific values, which is those 4 categories. And if somebody doesn't fit there, stick them in that 5th overflow valve group. But so that's what I would do. And I never, ever said that before. I would never have thought of doing that before, but I think it's important. Now, what does GLI Global do? For fitness for duty, in other words, are you above this cut point? The Black and Southeast Asians are going to fail their evaluation. Northeast Asians and whites will increase. They will pass the evaluation. It all depends on the lung size relative to the average. And so then for disability, Black and Southeast Asians, they are decreasing their percents of predicted, and so they look disabled even if they're not. Whereas Northeast Asians and whites, they're increasing, and so they don't look disabled even if they are. My final conclusion is that I think that using ATS's recent 2023 recommended race-neutral reference value, one value for everybody, for all races, may seriously affect the conclusions that you're going to see. So when you make a change to it, it means anything that you've seen before for your worker is not going to be relevant now. And I think that is premature, is what that is. And I wouldn't do it. But so my acknowledgments are to my co-authors on the paper, Phil Harbour and Clay Cole at Mayo, who teaches with me in the ACOM conference. And then also Brian Graham, and these 2 are American, these 2 are Canadian, Brian Graham, and then also Alice Lushim, who I've talked with extensively about the issues of all of this stuff, and they're very much in agreement. So thank you very much for your attention. And are there any questions? Do I have time for questions?
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes for some questions, if anybody has them. I think I saw something coming to the chat here.
Okay. Yeah. Right. One of them is about, I see the first question in the chat is about, the others are links. And in fact, I just heard the man, James Dio, who is a young man, talk about the first paper that came out where they estimated the people. I just heard him on Wednesday talk. He was a nice person. It was an interesting talk. In any case, but they said that race-specific reference values, it all depends what's correct, right? That's what my feeling is. So if they contribute to, so that, the reference value is lower for Blacks, then we miss pulmonary related injuries. And I think it is, I agree that is what will happen. The thing that I do not know is, where is the truth? That's, I think, the part that concerns me big time. And so it is, I don't know, I think it's a big issue. What I think is the way that, like with Brian Graham and and working with different companies that I've been in this field a long time. So I know a lot of the corporate health people. And so it's possible with US Steel that we will be able to collaborate with them in order at their plants and have additional physical measurements made of people. And so we can, and so that those would include like arm span length as well as ulna length are 2 possibilities. And so those would be added to the height and the weight that you do before the test. If what we can do is find out that if you adjust standing height by how long arm span is, because we are assuming that appendages are related to each other. Big long arms means probably big long legs. And so if we can predict the lung function without even thinking about what group do you belong to, I think we have the answer to this huge mess of a problem that is going on. But that takes further work. It takes a dedicated study. What has been going on so far is just analysis of existing data sets, and it's not going to work for this particular problem. But I think it is a real question of what is the truth here, and I don't know the answer to that. But I do believe if you look at NHANES and you see that African Americans, like my numbers, see, that's why I do numbers. I don't look at equations. So when I use their calculators, so I'm doing exactly what your spirometer does when you say this person is black and you're using NHANES, or this person is white and you're using NHANES. When I see differences, and NHANES is very similar to that GLI race specific, it's almost identical to it. NHANES was a lot of the data that were taken into GLI. But when I see those giant differences, it really is, I can't, those were real measurements of real people who self-identified that way. I think the grouping is where our problem is, but they self-identified as black, as white. And so that means those differences have been measured on people. And so that then when the relationship between age and height is looked at for that group, what that means is that lets us then precisely predict what the 30-year-old and the 70-inch tall man will be. But it's based on observations of real people. When I see differences like that, I just am like, I'm looking at data, basically. I mean, it's been going through an equation, but it's data. And so when those are big differences like that, I'm not sure where the truth is what I would say. And this is not, people mostly the idea has been that you would follow the ATS. We always have followed the ATS. In this case, though, this thing that they have done of using a different kind of reference value, GLI global, is not the same kind of interpretation that we have done for 60 years. And, everybody's like, oh yeah, well, it's a new broom. It will sweep out things and stuff, and it may, but it also could just be wrong. And that's the part that concerns me, I think. So does that answer it? I think that was Jamaica that asked the question. Are you there? Yeah, I see your face.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, I really am. I wish I could give you a very solid, answer, but all I can do is let you know I'm very skeptical. And I think, what do they say always? Further research is needed, but not more of the same, a different kind of research. But I think that's a real question, because if the African American looks, because they'll look, this will happen to them, just like what the math I showed you in those numbers. They will get smaller. So the question is then, is that just math that's doing that because this average lands in the middle? Or is this truly, and it's been viewed as this is truth? I'm not positive that it is. We have to make sure it's not just math. You don't want to make people be disabled or impaired who are really wanting to work. You don't want to do that. So anyway, I'm hoping that's a good answer. It's kind of long. Sorry for the length, but anyway. Okay, there's another one. Oh, thank you. Okay, good. Any other questions at all? Yeah, Chris?
I was just saying thank you. I was ready to give you applause here.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I know. It's the being virtual is a different thing. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's nice to see your face too. I've only emailed with you. So, okay, so if there's no other questions, then my advice to you basically is I would not jump on GLI Global for a reason that it's a different kind. It's not a usual reference value. It is a sea change in how you're saying that everybody on the planet, we expect them all to be the same. I don't see why that we would do that, for one thing, because the differences have been seen forever. So anyway, okay, thank you. So am I done? I don't know how this works. You can't.
No, we're gonna introduce Dr. Polinier here next, but thank you very much for your
Okay,
presentation.
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course, Chris. Thank you. Thanks for the question too, Jamiko. It's an important one.